On behalf of Steve Grafton, our board of directors, and all of the Alumni Association, I want to welcome you to our digital dialogue, Being Black at Michigan, Bridging the Gap Between Our Student and Alumni Experiences. I'm humbled by the interest and the turnout for this event amongst all of our alums, our students, our faculty, and our staff. Speaking of staff, my name is James McRae, and I am the Senior Associate Director for Student Engagement for the Alumni Association, and I will act as your moderator of sorts. One of the advantages to having virtual programming is that we can have participants join from virtually anywhere. From looking at our RSVPs today, participants are joining from Florida, California, Canada, Spain, Colombia, Brazil, and even India. It lets us know that conversations like the one we're about to have are relevant wherever you are. This event tonight is one in a series that will highlight diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. The series will address the myriad identities, experiences, and backgrounds of our diverse alumni and students. In today's event, we're exploring the power of intergenerational conversations. As an alumni association, it is our purpose to connect U of M alumni with the larger University of Michigan community, and that includes campus and especially students. We hear from alumni all the time that want to share their stories with students. And I'm in the unique position to talk to students as well, and believe me, they have stories to share as well. So today we have an alum and a student who are going to share their personal stories with each other and all of us. I'm excited to hear them talk about their experience of being Black at Michigan. It's important that we hear from multiple voices because being Black is not a singular experience across this identity. It is also a topic that we need to continue to push forward and not just have this dialogue in moments when racial injustice is highlighted in the media or when there's an inauguration about to happen. Today, Dr. Jallicia Jolly and Senior Thomas Vance are going to model how to have these conversations for us. I'll introduce our panelists in just a second, but first, I want to let you know how this dialogue is going to work. So we are seeking to have an organic discussion. So while various topics have been suggested to our panelists, they will let the conversation flow naturally. Once they have been introduced, I will actually leave the conversation, which is different than how we usually do a moderated panel. This will allow them to control what they talk about, when, and how the flow goes. I will rejoin at the end of the conversation to help facilitate the Q&A after the discussion. So please make sure you're submitting your questions throughout. We will do our best to get as many as possible answered, knowing that we probably won't get to them all. So that's it. That's how it's going to work tonight. But you didn't come here tonight to hear me talk. So on to our panelists. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jallicia Jolly, who is a writer, postdoctoral fellow, and incoming assistant professor in African American Studies and Black Studies at Amherst College. Dr. Jolly connects academic work to community interventions that advance anti-racism, institutional equity, and reproductive justice. Her research and teaching focus on the intersection of race, gender, class, and sexuality, Black women's health and activism, HIV/AIDS, racialized health disparities and intersectionality, and feminist organizing and reproductive injustice in the African diaspora. Her work has been supported by grants and fellowships, including the Fulbright Scholar Program, Yale University's Sarah Petit Doctoral Fellowship in Queer Studies, and U of M's Institute for the Humanities. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jallicia Jolly.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for that introduction, James.
No worries. Welcome, Dr. Jolly. So I'm going to introduce Thomas in a second, but I just want to know if you can share with us what brought you to this conversation today.
Indeed. Thank you for asking, and thank you for organizing such a wonderful series of events. And it's wonderful to be able to sort of kick off the series with this important conversation. And so I think what brought me to this conversation, I think it really evolved from the spirit of the 2020 uprisings and America's racial reckoning with its violent past and present. Like many and all of you, I was home in quarantine and COVID and watching and participating in some of these protest, and we had moments where people were putting their life and lungs on the line to actively protest these highly publicized anti-Black violence. It was a moment where we were faced with illness, vulnerability, and death marked by COVID-19 pandemic and its racialized and class disparities. And it was also an interesting moment to see universities sort of talk, not accountability, we'll get to that throughout our conversation, but universities disseminate statements in support of Black Lives Matter, and corporations as well, in unprecedented ways, right? Talking about we stand in solidarity with activists. You saw this huge increase of verbal commitments to anti-racism by organizations, by institutions, and increasingly in higher education. And it created a moment of pause for me and reflection and connection and reconnection with other folks who are thinking in similar ways about what does this mean, right? And what does equity have to do with it? And so this was a crucial moment where we were just thinking about what does it mean to have these meaningful conversations at a time when America is at war with itself, and how do we go from here and move forward while also building coalitions with students and alumni, by thinking about our past and present, by thinking about the legacies that we're inheriting and what they mean for strategic organizing and for movement building, as well as for the implications for holding institutions accountable to equity, right? And so we were thinking, what does it mean to not just get folks of color and Black bodies at a table, but really reimagining how investments in white supremacy and white elitism creates a crooked table that isn't just an exclusionary at best. So it was a desire to really reorient the sort of our positions, to think about institutional practices, to think about diversity and investments in meaningful equity, and to rethink how we can show up as students and alumni, right? Because eventually we graduate and we are sent out with our UMich degrees into the world. And what does equity, what does movement building, what does organizing have to do with all of that in these times?
Very, very well said. And yes, and I will say that having these conversations with you and our next panelists over the last couple of months has really gotten me excited for this conversation today. So thank you so much for joining us. And now I would like to introduce Thomas Vance, who is an LS&A senior majoring in political science and Afro-American and African studies. Thomas is a member of the Alumni Association family as a lead scholar and a former student employee. Thomas serves as the speaker of the Black Student Union, where he is working to improve the lives of current and future Black Wolverines. Please join me in welcoming Thomas Vance. All right. So Thomas, I ask you the same question. What brought you to this conversation today?
Yo, thank you for the introduction. I know the other 235 people in here are like, this kid's acting like a 5-year-old. It's because I'm super excited to have an intergenerational conversation about Blackness. When I first got the invitation, I was like, yo, James is the homie, we lit. And then in the meetings with Dr. Jolly, I was just solidified that I knew this was going to be something great. For a lot of similar reasons that Dr. Jolly identified, I think this summer, at least for me, was very frustrating because it was, the Black tile on Instagram, I think is the thing that everybody pokes the most fun at, but that's because it's comedy. Because for non-Black people, or even for Black people that may not have been tuned into America since its founding, or at least since one of the first major cases of a shooting of an unarmed Black man, just the Trayvon Martin case back when I was in high school. For a lot of Black folks, I was like, what happened to George Floyd was like nothing new. But for a lot of non-Black people, I think the convergence of COVID and people are not working, people are paying more attention to what's going on around them, then it's like, wow, this is really an issue. Which is fine and dandy, but the drawback is that it feels, at least for me, it felt like the response was overwhelming and the response was very new. And so being speaker of, I think, one of the hardest, like hard as in good hard, like that's hard, one of the hardest Black organizations on campus, I was just like, yeah, I think I really want to use this opportunity to talk to my high school English teacher who I saw is here, to talk to some of my peers, talk to some of my college professors, mentors, and mentees, just about what a Black experience is like at Michigan. And one thing I always say whenever I do a panel is that I could only speak for my experience. Uh, I do not seek to, and I do not try to speak for all Black students at the University of Michigan. Because some people think, oh, the BSU speaker said this, so that must be everybody's perspective, and that's cap. So, yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Thomas. So, at this point, this is where I'm going to kind of bow out. As I said, we want to have an organic conversation, and I want to turn it over to you two. And maybe, you can start from sharing some of the highlights of your experiences on campus, and we see where the chat takes you from there. So are you two ready? All right, then I will bow out, and everyone, please listen closely because this is going to be good.
Good deal. So Dr. Jolly, I guess I can kick it off. PhD program, much longer than being an undergrad. So you were at the university for a little bit, got to see some of the changes, like post BBUM, and then I guess you were here for the election, right? The 2016 election. So what was the graduate experience like at the University of Michigan, and just seeing those, half decade changes?
Yeah, no, thanks for reminding me that I was there for the 2016 election. It's a memory I sometimes try to forget. But yes, it was such an important historical moment, from 2014 to 2020. And so many things happened in addition to what you named, the election. And on the heels of BBUM, I came also at the time where Aurora Ross was executed by the Ann Arbor police. I came at the time when Ferguson was burning, in response to the organized resistance of activists against the highly profiled state-sanctioned killing of Mike Brown. And so this was happening along with sort of transitioning to graduate education. And I think I sort of had a moment where I was thinking, well, what does this mean? what are the implications of this degree, and why does it matter? And at different points in the graduate career for me, I think me and many of my peers and colleagues had that question about, like, just thinking about the parallels between the journey and milestones of adhering to, this rigid understanding of graduate education, of completing your exams, of taking coursework, not in that order, taking coursework, completing exams, doing field research, interacting with a broader community of scholars, all of these sort of milestone markers at a time when you're also thinking about sort of violence, the manifestations of marginalization in bodies, in policy, in power dynamics, at the university, and so I think both of these things were happening in parallel, and it prompted the question about, well, what does this all mean, and why does this all matter? So I think it was wonderful to be able to enter into a space where there was such strong student activism. And I know that as you and I speak, Thomas, we're speaking from this tradition and an intergenerational legacy of student activism, of Black students and their accomplices from the 1960s onward, who have made these very important demands about funding for students, about Black faculty hires, about sort of expanding the curriculum, right? And I also just briefly want to mention that, given that Martin Luther King Jr. Celebration is on Monday, was 1968, the day that MLK Jr. was buried in Atlanta, that the newly formed BSU at the time took over the LSE administration building and chained themselves inside for 5 hours to make these demands, right? And so we're operating in this content. Of course, you know that history well, as a current student and active member of the BSU. And so I came in at this time with this profound legacy. And I think my peers and I, and like friends, people in the graduate community, and of course, undergraduates, I think many of the sort of relationships and networks that I was building were people who were trying to make sense of the time about what it meant to pursue a degree, but to have these very important critical activist commitments, what it meant to be invested in this sort of trajectory, not just for the aim of sort of fulfilling the markers of success, but thinking about what does this mean for community engaged work, for the sort of concrete impacts of what your work means for the lives that you impact, and for disseminating knowledge in a way that was meaningful and relevant to the times, and not just simply relevant to 3 scholars that would cite you in the best journal, right? So we were thinking about what does this mean? Like, what does this all mean? And what is the sort of larger purpose in which you were doing this work and thinking about this work. And so much happened 2014, 2015, 2016 in that year that we can go down the list for, but I'll stop there to say sort of that's the kind of framing that facilitated my entrance into this space. And I would also love to know a little bit more about what facilitated your entrance and how did you make sense as you started your undergraduate career of what was happening at the university, but also in the national global landscape.
Yeah, one of the things I really like that you touched on was you're doing all this stuff. For me, I'm going through undergrad. For you, going through a PhD program, hitting these milestones, and that's all framed by what's going on around the world, and how you can't separate yourself from Blackness no matter where you are. And for me, I got to Michigan. Coming from high school, I knew I wanted to major in African American studies because I was like, I want to just be able to sit in classes and learn Black history. And I knew I wanted to get involved in the BSU because they seemed like a pretty big deal. They had some really sick hats, t-shirts, and hoodies, and they were all free. All the meetings had food. And it just seemed like I like, what you watch movies, you hear about people's college experiences, and it's always like the BSU, the BSU. And that's I wanted to get a part of that, not knowing the the legacy, the history of being a part of a broader Black radical tradition, and also being a part of student activism at the university. And so I went to my first history meeting, and I was really able to gain an appreciation of that and hear from former speakers and hear from people who'd been in the BSU throughout the years. But then, as I kept doing it, I was the historian my first year, I was the treasurer my second year, and in my final year, I'm the speaker. Um, but all of that is framed with my experience. My freshman year, before I knew what the BSU was, we had bias incidents on campus where people were writing the N word on somebody's whiteboard on their dorm room door. People writing the N word on bathrooms in South Quad, and it's just like you hear about these things, and it's not necessarily, oh, that can't happen to me, but you're like, wow, people are really bold. And I had a little bit of an understanding of that because this is kind of funny. Before I came to the university, the summer before I came to the university, I got a copy of the Michigan Daily in the mail, and for a good 20 to 21 pages, it was bias incident and then response immediately after. And I was like, oh, this what y'all on. And so I came into school with an understanding of like, okay, that's weird. Hopefully that's not the case. And then that was the case. And so as speaker, it's like, how do you build community when the worst case scenario in your mind is what is going to jump off this year that we can't predict? Last year when I was SEBA, it was like, because I knew what happened freshman year. So my sophomore year, I'm sitting here wondering, okay, something's going to happen that we can't predict. Junior year, same thing. Senior year, the same thing. And even though we're virtual and, people may not be able to deface a dorm room door now, or a bathroom mirror, it's like you are always concerned with what new thing are non-Black people going to do to keep you in your place, put you in your place. And then you get Trump, and you throw that in there. You think about the insurrection. You think it's an amalgamation of factors, and it's really hard to keep up within your mind. So I try to just stay focused on community building, but at the same time, it's hard to do that when you're always thinking about what the worst case scenario could be. Um, and so, and with that, I kind of wanted to ask you, like, so when you were on campus, what organizations were you a part of? What action were you a part of? Um, how were you able to balance, you know, doing doctoral research, hitting those milestones, um, without feeling like you may be sacrificing your Blackness or, yeah, that kind of thing?
So thank you for just that helpful context. I often wonder about what a lot of graduate students often wonder in sort of in depth about what the undergraduate experience is like. And we have these opportunities to learn a little bit more about it at various events, at protests, at town halls, and in classrooms, and et cetera. But it's really also refreshing to hear that. Um, and I also wanted to mention the piece about community building, as you mentioned, and just how like important that is to sort of leverage in addressing, when the next thing will jump off, but also being able to think about our survival, our restoration, and our joy. And I think community building was a sort of central aspect of my own graduate experience, whether that be through the organizations, student organizations, or whether that be through sort of informal mobilizations, or whether that be through just literally, happy hour connections outside of the classroom space. And so I think what what you described in terms of like community building that is really thinking about a being strategically responsive to whatever might pop off next. I think it's also such this emphasis on community building and on political mobilization has been so integral to when we think about the Black radical tradition, when we think about the sort of legacies that we've inherited from Black social movements. So I just want to hold that piece near and dear to our heart as we continue this conversation. And how so much of what we invest in is the community, because we are a beloved community, and you move forward with the people that are near you, right? So finding that mutuality, that interdependence is so critical to any kind of movement building, to any challenge to white supremacy, to any investments in institutional transformation. To your question about what organizations I was involved with. So I was involved with the Students of Color of Rackham, SCORE, and Rackham Student Government, RSG. And the SCORE is a graduate organization that is a network for Rackham graduate and professional students at Michigan. And RSG is the sort of governing body over Rackham graduate students broadly. And I think both of those experiences in different ways taught me just a knowledge, and it was great to build community with people across the disciplines, across the schools, and to sort of connect with folks outside of, solely your discipline or department. Making those broader connections, you get to see kind of what's happening at different parts of the college, at the university, and whether best practices or continued themes that are, not pleasing, but really finding the connection so that you can understand the broader graduate school experience, and particularly for graduate students of color. It was really helpful. And I think what was wonderful too about being a part of those different student groups was also learning more about the knowledge of how the institution works and operates, which you don't always get insight to if you're not, sort of having that insider knowledge in different ways, whether that be through speaking to administrators often, or speaking to political leadership, or speaking to other student activists who have been doing this work for a longer time than you. And it's that knowledge of how the institution operates, coupled with the strategic investments in institutional transformation, that I think really made my experience. And so that for me is kind of what allowed me to sort of get the endurance and the sort of strength to be able to see something that was not solely focused on my academics and my intellectual trajectory or my professional context, but also part of the professionalization and part of the sort of community building and development is student development and well-being, is being able to understand what is the broader context in which many of these policies, these experiences are unfolding and operating in, and how do you improve them with the sort of knowledge and community and efforts of a collective body of students and their accomplices. And so I think that's sort of one of the ways that I really relied on community building to navigate these different spaces. And there are also wonderful staff and administrators that were helpful in sort of sharing their expertise and their experience to graduate students and other students who were trying to figure out how do you connect the dots? How do you make navigate the ropes? And if this is happening when you were here 20, 30, 40 years ago, and it's still a reoccurring trend, how do you figure out how to not always have to reinvent the wheel, but to be able to exchange strategies to make it a better place for yourself and those who come after you? And so that was a large part of my experience. And I think one of the things that I'd love to transition to is kind of also learning a little bit more about your organizing groups. So I know the student of color Liberation Front is one of them, in addition to the BSU. And, you know, it seems like a core part of what you do is also thinking about coalitions and how do you mobilize coalitions for broader systemic changes, as well as that interpersonal community building. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that aspect of your work that you're currently working on.
Yeah. So one of the things that really struck a chord was you learn how the institution operates, which can be super helpful because you have the background, but super frustrating because then it's up to you to relay that information to the people you're working with and to your community and say, okay, we want to do this, but they won't do it this way. So now we have to come up with a different way to achieve the same goal.
Yeah.
And that is the conversation that we're currently having in the Students of Color Liberation Front. But SOC-LF, that's our acronym, has been immensely important this year. And while like this was the first year that we put a title on it, we're having regular meetings. It's an idea that we've really kicked around since I was on the executive board because we understand that there are, you know, very big racial justice organizations on campus, the United Asian American Organizations, the Arab Students Association, the Students Allied for Freedom and Equality, the Native American Students Association, and La Casa. There are so many organizations, and we are all trying to balance improving existing structures for current Wolverines and raising and cultivating that next generation of future Wolverines. And so with that, it's like you're doing programming, but you're also trying to do high school conferences, and you're also trying to get tapped in with the admissions office so you can have some of that peer-to-peer recruitment. And so the nice part about this coalition is that this year we've been really focused on sustainability because we don't want this to be something that happens this year and then fizzles. We want this to be something, you know, that continues to happen every year, regardless of it's a pop-in year where some stuff happens, or it's a relatively lax year where we can focus on internal community building, but also trying to recruit some more students that look like our respective communities. And so a big push that we've done this year is we united to get rid of the Michigan Ambassadors program, which I think was an idea. I don't think it was a particularly good idea because you were pairing students with armed officers initially, and then unarmed officers or unsworn officers to go and enforce COVID rules coming off of a summer of, not just George Floyd. Breonna Taylor didn't die this summer, but I guess everybody found out about it this summer. So coming off of months of police brutality, not just George Floyd, not just Breonna Taylor, not just Tony McDade, you got Ahmaud Arbery, even though that wasn't police violence, it was still racial violence. You got David McAtee. You have people who died and were injured and who are being currently surveilled by the police because of their hand in the protest. And so it's like, okay, so yeah, let's take all of that. Let's take that context and then let's put cops to patrol campus in a group to enforce the COVID rules. And for us, that was a hard no, especially because we thought that it was being applied to students that didn't look like us. And so when we went into these meetings with the Office of Student Life, and we asked kind of for some numbers and who's this being enforced on, the answer was not necessarily very clear, but pretty clear, that it wasn't members of our communities, but members of other communities. And so while that was kind of a launching point for us to come together and get something done, what that's turned into is, meeting biweekly consistently with the Office of Student Life, meeting with the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion to find ways that our organizations can partner with these different institutions and different university structures to improve the lives of Black students, Arab students, Palestinian students, Latinx students, Asian students, and not just East Asian students, also Pacific Islander students, because they're left out of the conversation, Native and Indigenous students, just find ways to partner so that this university, works for everybody. Because we know who it works really well for, and we know where the gaps are. But I think a lot of the disconnect is between undergraduate students and the university and administrators, just because they don't have the same connection. And I think that interdependence, we've been allowed to expand that a little more to not just be interdependent within our own communities, but across communities. And a big emphasis on we're supporting each other. We're not codependent, we're interdependent. So that way we can still continue to lift each other up. We can still continue to operate on our own, but we can come together and achieve some common goals. And so and while the community building piece of that has been extremely important, I've really just found joy in having a sustainable coalition, and being able to be a part of that. And so I've heard that you are also part of Coalition-esque, the Alumni Against Anti-Blackness. So I believe the acronym is A3. So you're working A3. What's that been like? Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for that. I think I love what you described in terms of sustainability and including, for me, the community building and sustainability is something that is core to how I came to and am thinking about co-creating Alumni Against Anti-Blackness. And so as sort of as the events around anti-Blackness and these investments in anti-racism work verbally a lot of the times were happening, I think one of the questions that I had was, what does equity have to do with it? And also, how do you not consistently reinvent the wheel, especially if we know that white supremacy, white elitism, privilege operates in similar ways with similar power logics, but very different manifestations across the different social political realms and across different times and space, right? So how do we not reinvent the wheel? But also, how do we learn from sort of previous people who were students here, alumni, who have, who are navigating, who are thinking about how to navigate and connect to the university after they've left the space. And so Alumni Against Anti-Blackness came from sort of the experiences and this thought process and conversations that I was having with other alum who were really thinking about, okay, so after you've graduated, what is your relationship to the college? And as you're thinking about what is your relationship to the college, for those who've experienced like discrimination and marginalization within the walls of the University of Michigan as they were studenting and, trying to be whole beings while navigating, figuring out how to retrieve this degree, why do we consistently hear, oh, that was happening when I was there. Oh, I had that issue when I was there. Or, we fought for those same things 30, 40, 60 years ago. If we think about sort of the demands that are being, that we're seeing, the need for the certain things around enrollment and around recruitment, around investments and well-being, around certain resources and sort of institutional support that we need in order to do that. And this is not to invalidate the work that is already being done. And I think a lot of people would say that there are, various folks across the university who are making these investments and who are working collectively and individually to try to figure out how do you make your department, your school, and the general administration a better place for people of color as they're navigating their educational journeys. And so, and for as they're navigating their work journeys, right, as faculty as well and staff. And so I think in different ways, this is a part of a long going and prolonged conversation. But what I think is very, stands out to me and kind of how I was thinking about with others, alumni against anti-Blackness is what does it mean to have a sustainability, as you mentioned, and community of intergenerational sort of knowledge sharing strategies, exchanging among UMich alumni. I think the context is really how do we leverage our large and robust and vibrant alumni community to use our capital, our power and knowledge to develop these sustained commitments to advance an anti-racist work within our space, right? Within the walls of the University of Michigan and beyond it. And I think part of it is also elevating anti-racist practices that are useful for current and prospective future students, as well as for people who will eventually graduate from the community and go into the broader world to do the work that they're, sort of destined or desire to do. And so I think a few of us alum are in the process of sort of expanding to sort of develop strategies, but also build an agenda around what this intergenerational coalition building can look like between students and alumni, and especially that is centering the sort of knowledge and experiences of both to figure out how we can not reinvent the wheel every time another crisis happens. And every time that there is a need for the sort of knowledge to be disseminated. And I would say to sort of rewind and take a step back, there were two, in addition to sort of the political context, there were two other reasons behind this idea, which was that there has to be non-monetary ways to engage with our expansive and vibrant alumni community. And it also has to extend beyond sports. So what does it mean to have these more organic connections and to think about ways that alumni and can engage each other, but also can engage students that will have these concrete impacts on the improvement of Black experiences and the improvement of the well-being, on the educational opportunities, on the sort of just general qualitative experiences of people of color who at the college, of marginalized people at the college, right, at the university. So in addition to that sort of more organic way, was also figuring out how then do you sort of build on the inheritances of these activist legacies and really share them, right? When you get alumni in a room, I'm always amazed at how not only willing they are to connect with each other and support each other's professional endeavors, but also how when Black alumni get together, how we talk about the sort of real, concrete and embodied impacts of the experiences of exclusion, of marginalization, of violence, right? White supremacy and other forms of interpersonal systemic. In addition to talking about the sort of wonderful relationships developed and connections built to help facilitate a successful navigation of the time and space, right? But that you're a student at Michigan. But I think what really stands out to me is kind of how can we connect across generations, and what does this connection mean for what we create during our times there, but when we leave as well, right? How do we eliminate anti-Blackness in our communities? And how do we hold institutions accountable for doing this work, right? So it's more than just a Black Lives Matter in this summer 2020 moment, but it's like, what next? And what kind of support, knowledge, resources, investments matters beyond sort of just a liberalized diversity and inclusion context. I didn't mention equity because I think that's a different kind of investment that involves more concrete action, that beyond just getting people of color on a brochure or in a room, right? And so that's what we're thinking about, the different experiences of Blackness and different experiences of movement building, and how we can really exchange those across the generation to think about how to improve the experiences holistically for when we're there and when we graduate. And so that's the one thing I enjoyed a lot in our conversation, was just sort of thinking about those possibilities of alumni, student, coalition building, and also thinking about what that means for those who are still navigating an experience like yourself, or folks like me who recently graduated in the context of this very interesting political climate and moment, to think about what that means for the kind of possibilities that can come out of such connections. And so, yeah, how do you envision, one of the questions I wanted to ask you was just sort of, how do we envision keeping this momentum and building it, right now that many times when the sort of uprisings happen and they're no longer dominating the media, the sort of fizzle removes itself. It's less sexy for people to think about Black liberation, Black Lives Matter, systemic racism, anti-racism, and all these things that became buzzwords in our recent summer. What does accountability among allies and accomplices look like? And how do we keep this moving forward beyond summer 2020, which is behind us now, but not its legacies, of course?
Love it, allies question, because one of my hardest bars, I think, that I've ever said in my life is, if I can't stop being Black, then you can't stop being an ally. And for me, it's kind of the same thing when I think about other communities. If people in Palestine are, if the Israeli Defense Force is not going to stop doing what it's doing, and it's not going to stop entering Palestine, then I can't stop using my position to advocate for Palestinians, both in Palestine and across the globe. And so I think the momentum question is very important. And for some of y'all who use social media, I know some of you all may still use Facebook. If you're that age demographic, I'm kidding. Or maybe use MySpace, I don't know. Or Instagram. We'll take Instagram. No one's gonna upload a post on Instagram at 1:32 a.m. It's not gonna get likes. It's not appealing. The Instagram algorithm's all messed up. You're going for your peak times, maybe Saturday at 3 p.m. when everybody's on their phones. And I think right now, Black Lives Matter, but not just the acronym, not just the organization, not just what those three words mean, but Black liberation. I think right now is Saturday at 3 p.m. But I'm worried about Monday, when it's super late at night or super early in the morning, and people aren't talking about it, people aren't thinking about it, except those of us who are trying to do the work, who are trying to make conditions better. And so I think at least the role that students are playing, like myself, like every other BSU e-board member, I love y'all. If y'all are here, I love you. If you're here, if you're not here, it doesn't matter. I still love you anyway. Like everybody on the Students' Car Liberation Front, what we're trying to do is be like, hey, University of Michigan, these things really matter. We saw you just put in a new VP of Student Life. What's up, Dr. Harmon? Let's chop it up. Let's stress and reiterate the importance that these things matter. But I think nationally, it is a challenge when you think about everybody's priorities, because everybody's priorities are not the same. Whereas, you know, I can't speak for all Black people, but at least myself focus on Black liberation. Um, Whereas, in our current moment, people are like, okay, that's cool and all, but I need a stimulus check because I got to put food on the table and a roof over my kid's head. And, I will support Black people as much as I can, but I can't donate right now. I have to go to work, so I can't be out protesting. I may not have broadband, and I live in a rural area, and I can't sign a change.org petition because I need a computer to do that. Um, and so it's like, damn, when you have that convergence and you understand that this is not something on everybody's priority list, how do you keep up the momentum? Um, so at least with what I'm trying to do with students, I think that piece is there. You also spoke to anti-blackness, and I think about that as well as within our own communities. Because I think if you're focused on Black liberation, there's no room for homophobia, there's no room for transphobia, There's no room for anti-immigrant rhetoric. There's no room for sexism. There's no room for colorism. There's just no room for any form of bigotry, because all Black people at the end of the day are still Black people, regardless of religion, regardless of, this is a hot take, political party. We're all still Black, and so if you're focused on Black liberation, then that should be the goal. And so while this is a moment where I'm just like, I don't know. I don't know how we keep the Saturday at 3 p.m. momentum. I think that for the 235 people who are tuning in, for us and for, James, Natalie, and Tam, I think, and I hate when people say this, like, having conversations like these is how we keep it going. Because in reality, having conversations is not enough. People are still dying. People are still getting shot. The police are still getting called for mental health crises that could have been resolved by something a bajillion times better. But this is what we have given coronavirus. And if this is what we have, we take what we learn at conversations like these and we implement it in practice. Because it's one thing to be like, I went to that Being Black at Michigan chat. I'm woke. I'm going to put #progressive on my next Instagram post. Mm-hmm. But it's a whole nother thing to really think about what you can do to be actively anti-racist. And I feel like everybody's like, oh yeah, I read, Ibram X. Kennedy's book over the summer. I know how to be anti-racist. It's a New York Times bestseller. I listened to the Audible book. But it's like, I would challenge people, if that's your experience, that's cool and all. But what have you done? How have you shifted? And what are you doing outside of educating? Because while I think educating yourself is really important, I think oftentimes people get worried about, oh, well, I haven't read enough. I haven't watched enough YouTube videos. I haven't listened to enough podcasts. But at the same time, you got to understand that, Black folks, timeline. To me, extinction is imminent from climate change, maybe even from COVID. I don't know. So it's like, what are you going to do? When are you going to, it's going to click where you say, okay, now I want to get involved. That's beyond conversation, and beyond just education. But I think something else you spoke to was, in your conversations with alum, people are like, oh, I was advocating for that 30 to 60 years ago. And I think the narrative around Black people, especially Black women, is resilience. And it's cool and all, but why do we have to be resilient? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So much of what you shared spoke to me, and I don't even know where to start. But the threads that I definitely want to follow up on are the resilience piece, right? The expectation of it. And you asked something before that about, what did you ask before that? What was the question before
that? Definitely resilience, and then maybe if you want to talk about anti-Blackness in our own communities, just whatever you're feeling. I feel like we're sitting on the porch,
right.
Stuff. Yeah.
Right, the porch in darkness, right? Winter. So I wanted to definitely, so before even mentioning this resilience piece, that is an excellent question that I'm happy that you brought up. I also wanted to mention what you talked about in terms of the need to pair these kinds of conversations and the dissemination of reading resources with concrete action. And I think about this as I think about the ways institutions often outsource the diversity and inclusion work, sometimes the equity work, that's a new thing, to that one black face in a high space, right? Or that one Latinx person doing that leadership work, or that one, and hire them, and perhaps sometimes don't give them the full resources of an office with a team that is needed to invest in this work, because we know that this kind of work is a collective project, and it's a long haul thing, and it requires investments at multiple levels, not just the one person of color in the high space doing that work, right? And I wanted to bring that back to the logics of white supremacy and power, and how that is so much enmeshed in anti-Blackness, which is the idea that this work is not my own, right? It's your own. So I'll hire you so you can do your own work. And I think so when you think about elimination anti-Blackness and its multiple impacts and infection of so many different aspects of our lives, the interpersonal, the communal, the classroom, the learning environment, education, healthcare, et cetera, medicine, and the list goes on. It intersects with so many spaces, and it's so multidimensional that it can never be done. It can never be eliminated with just a conversation. It can never be eliminated with just one diversity officer or office, right? And so I appreciate the sort of understanding of the multiple levels of this work. And then the question that brings up for me is, so are you going to put your money where your mouth is, right? Are you going to put the sort of multi-pronged investments in this work if you say that it's something that you want to do? And is it going to be something for the long haul? Is it going to be prolonged? Are you going to follow up on it and renew resources? And I think that's the stuff that I'm thinking about when I think about your last comment about what it means to do this work and make it and sustainability alongside that, right? It's that investment from the top down as well as bottom up, but definitely top down. But then it's also thinking about that larger community and collective that's needed to sort of carry this on. And it's also about the action, right? And I think it's like recognizing that there are different ways to advocate. There are different ways to sort of create institutional transformation. There are different ways to eliminate anti-Blackness, systemic racism. You can be in the institution, you can be in the streets, right? It's not we shouldn't treat those as mutually exclusive. You can, if there is a strike happening, for example, the labor. One thing graduate students did this last semester was strike and think about what happens when we take part in labor action, right? And not just putting our life and lungs on the line, but reclaiming the value of reclaiming the value of graduate student labor, which we know the universities benefit from tremendously. And one of the things I can think about there was the few professors who sort of sacrificed their privilege and supported the work stoppage, right? And I think about, well, what do we compromise? Are you willing to compromise your privilege? Are you willing to be an ally or an accomplice where there are concrete consequences for these compromises, right? What are you willing to give up when you stand with those who are most marginalized and most vulnerable, right? And so I think about all of these things together as I'm thinking about anti-Blackness, as I'm thinking about the concrete examples for how we invest in communities and how we recognize our interdependence, even if there are class markers, institutional status, race, and these multiple different social identity markers that position us differently to vulnerability, to death, to illness, to opportunity, right? So to your second question, I am so sick and tired as well. Sick and tired of being sick and tired, channeling Fannie Lou Hamer here. And of this question, of this, it's not even a question, of this assertion of resilience, right? Like you and I'm assuming when you mention it, you're talking about the way it's been used in sort of discourses around activism and institution building. And yeah, there's almost an expectation that you bounce back, that you bounce back, you swallow the vulnerability, you swallow the marginalization, and you figure it out, you put it together. And when you survive, you come out triumphant and you've made it. So that's all that matters. And I think that is a whole bunch of BS, because what we need to start talking and thinking about is the way these kinds of vulnerabilities and marginalizations, when they're reinforced, concretized, and imposed by institutional practices, policies, and power dynamics, really create cultures and circumstances and conditions that entrench our slow death, that kill our souls, and that really make it harder to create any sustainable change and support well-being in these spaces. And I think I'm sick and tired, as you are, of the resiliency discourse, and have shifted really to thinking about not just valorizing resiliency at the expense of Black well-being and liberation, but really thinking critically and intentionally about who benefits from our resiliency, are the assumption and imposition and assertion of it, and thinking about when we know who benefits and when we know that resiliency ain't working, what does it mean then to think about what accountability looks like, feel like here, and what work is necessary to demand, require, and sustain that? So that's sort of how I'm viewing it.
And I know that moderators are saying that we're going to wrap up soon. Uh, but with that, I feel like oftentimes these conversations we just hear about, people are looking like, dang, those two black people are really pissed off. Like, they bet you they don't have any fun. They just think about all these big issues. But I feel like we never hear about, like, what do we do for fun? So what do you do for fun? What brings you joy? And it doesn't, and I feel like, and this doesn't have to be, because I know some people in academia are like, oh, this is resistance when black people are happy, which is definitely not what I'm trying to get at. But what do you do for fun? What brings you joy? And how do you not necessarily make sense of the world, but you just how you get through it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Well, let's start with you, brother. Tell me, answer that question. Tell me what you do for fun. And I thank you for asking it because it's so important as we're thinking about well-being, endurance, and how we thrive amidst it all.
Yeah. So, couple things. One, TikTok compilations. Big fan of TikTok. I watch them on YouTube for 30 minutes at a time. Visix, best TikTok comps. Second, Love Island UK season 1. Shout out to my friend for putting me on. And third, a lot of rap music. I'm talking Young Thug, Future, Uzi, Playboy Cardi. Whole Lot of Red was a good album. A lot of people think it was trash. I thought it was pretty good. Um, and food, I've been air frying lots of chicken wings over break, all kinds, honey hot, teriyaki, curry, lemon pepper. So yeah, no, and I like to make jokes in Zoom chats when I'm in class.
Ah,
So those are the things I do for fun, in addition to, thinking about big issues and feeling the pressure of having to save the world every other day. But I do find time to take to myself and riding my bike. Love riding my bike.
that's wonderful. I have to taste some of your cooking, by the way. So food, I eat it. Netflix, I watch Girlfriends. It's one of my joys, and I'm about to finish all the seasons, so I need to find something else to watch. So if you have any suggestions, please email me, text. Um, and also connecting with friends and and family members virtually right now. I think one of the things that quarantine and this pandemic has shown us is just the various ways we can connect and reach out to people, even if it's distant. I also enjoy writing poetry um, and just finding different ways to do this work in community to just make the future more livable and desirable and survivable as we figure out how we might enter it. So yeah, those all provide me with nourishment.
That's the good stuff.
Yeah.
That's the good stuff. All right. I think James said he's ready to jump in. Dr. Jolly, thank you for answering all my questions. I felt like this was less of an interview and more of a fantastic chat with the GOAT. So I really
Thank
appreciate you.
you, Thomas. It was wonderful learning from you.
Well, the two of you have thanked each other. I want to thank both of you that I was I was jotting down notes and just smiling ear to ear the whole time through all of that. So thank you so much. We do have some questions that some people have put into our chat, and I encourage everyone to continue to put questions in. Again, we will get to as many of them as we possibly can. Thomas, I love that you ended off asking what you all do for fun, because that was actually one of my questions that I was going to ask. Because I do think you're right. Sometimes with conversations like this, they get so heavy that everyone's like, man, you need to take a break. So wonderful, wonderful.
Absolutely.
And the first few questions that came in actually came from alums who were in school during BAM 1, 2, and 3. Another one who commented that he was in the locked himself in the LSNA during the MLK funeral in '68. And So first, I just want to kind of take a moment to acknowledge all of those alums out there who have been doing the good work for such a long time and was doing it on campus back before any of us were on campus. So just want to take a moment to acknowledge these trailblazers, and just the love is there. So transitioning into a question, and I'm combining a couple of questions here, is you touched on it a little bit, but they're kind of asking the question of, what do you see has changed from what you know of what the activism was looking like back then? What do you see has changed, and how do you fight, if you have this frustration, how do you fight that frustration of feeling that not much has changed? And I'll direct that to Dr. Jolly first.
So the last part was, how do we fight the frustration of feeling that not much has changed? What was the first part?
First part was just what do you think has changed in the last 50 years or so?
Mm-hmm. Whoa, the last 50 years. Well, for the second part of the question, I think one of the ways I deal with frustration is reaching out to a broader political activist community, reaching out to other people who have lived through their times in the spaces that I have, and really just getting some perspective about how to navigate the institution, but also how to develop strategies that can weather the tides, right? And how not to be just reactive in a moment, although that is necessary at times, especially when you think about these very heightened moments of white supremacist violence that happens at different waves. But also thinking about, how do you then leverage the sort of rage and emotions and power to really think through very carefully and intentionally what a coordinated and strategic response might be. And so I think organizing and community building, as I had mentioned, is like my route to formative processing their traumas. And in terms of what has changed, I'd love to hear what you think about this too, Thomas. But I think over the years, from just like looking at what Black scholars have wrote about Black student activism at Michigan and its history, thinking of scholars such as Matthew Countryman and Austin, I'm blanking on his last name right now. I think learning from, and Martha Jones, I think learning from those folks, as well as sort of witnessing in the last 6 years that I think what has changed is kind of the way students have, I think the dynamics between the institution and students have changed a bit. I think there seems to be sort of an investment in making sure that the activists and legacies and inheritances are not forgotten and are centered through current movements. And I think what has been an ongoing sort of presence is that direct action, that internal external pressure, and that movement building. And I think also what has changed or what has expanded is ways to think intentionally about how not to make institutions co-opt radical Black politics, and how to not sort of subsume everything underneath the banner of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because some things will not, diversity trainings will not lead to liberation, and co-optation often really sort of drains out the kind of important radical work that is taking place in different spaces. So I think that has changed, a recognition of how to strategically consider direct action, pressure, and movement building in relation to institutions, co-optations, Michigan and others, but then of this radical liberal radical work, but then also the sort of legacies that are still reverberating and that students are building on as we speak.
In terms of what has changed, of course, I can go draw out of the BSU history. We've always demanded 10% Black enrollment. hasn't happened yet. We peaked around 8%, but with the passage of the super progressive Michigan Civil Rights Initiative, affirmative action is not a thing in the state of Michigan anymore, which makes it more challenging, because now Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Office of Undergraduate Admissions has to figure out ways to find Black students or find students of color who may not just have the opportunity, who may not have heard of Michigan, who Michigan may not be on their radar because they're not in an environment that allows them to dream big or that encourages them to dream big. But there's a Trotter Multicultural Center on State Street. And while I have a lot of hot takes on the word multicultural and the idea of multiculturalism, especially with the building that was advocated for Black students and built originally for Black students, it still exists as a meeting space for Black students, and for those who align with the mission of the Trotter Multicultural Center. The Black Student Union exists. We are university funded, and so we have the funds to both act as a funding source for our community, as well as put on programming for our community. And so I saw there was a question in the chat about how we're reaching out to LGBTQ plus students who are Black. And I do think that's a challenge because, as much as myself and Dr. Jolly can get up here and talk about why we don't think homophobia is a good thing. Yeah, why we don't think homophobia is a good thing or transphobia is a good thing. At the same time, at least I'm coming from a community and coming from conversations, especially when you think about the Black church, or at least Black Catholics, where it's like, no one really has an inclusive conversation about different gender identities or different sexualities. And so that's always something that we're trying to improve. How do we make, like when we have a sex meeting, when we talk about sex, because we're college students, we can talk about consensual sex. How do we make sure that those are not, just heteronormative? Or how do we make sure that we have programs and we have outreach that is for our queer and trans Black communities? The BSU is at the discussion table, at the negotiation table with the Office of Student Life, with the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. We are at the president's house on South University, chopping it up, eating really bougie Cottage Inn. Like these are things that are happening. This is some level of progress, but at the same time, we have to realize that this is not the end goal. This is just another step for us to be, Black liberation. And I did see a question in the chat. Sorry if this is too much. I have some hot takes. I did see a question about diverse views, and I think that's really important. But I think if you're down for Black liberation, regardless of if you're a Democrat, Republican, or independent, I think Black liberation is something you can incorporate into your politics, because Blackness is not separate from politics the same way that politics is not separate from Blackness. Whatever policies we advocate for, and if somebody's like, oh, who's this senior? I'm a political science, African American studies double major. I got to throw the credentials out there because people think I'm talking out of my behind sometimes. But the policies that we advocate for, the people that we choose to uplift, are affected by who we see in our communities, are affected by who we interact with at work, at school, who our kids are friends with, who they bring home. And so, thinking about Blackness and thinking about everything else in the world, I think that there is always room for Black liberation ideology in your politics that you subscribe to. So yeah, that kind of answered your question and kind of went a different direction. So I'll hand it back to you, James. I'm sorry.
No worries. Thank you, Thomas. I knew what we were getting into and asking you to be on this panel. So I do want to address something too that you brought up, some of the questions in the chat. There are some questions about different identities being represented in this dialogue series. And I just want to address that for everyone, that the dialogue series that's happening over the next month are focused on certain topics, but this is a series that we plan to have ongoing, and we want to represent the entire alumni and student community. So whatever identities that means you have, we want to do as much as we can to expand this, to continue the conversations everywhere. So I just wanted to take a second to address that. And thank you both for answering that. So I'm going to go in a little bit different direction here. So the next question I have up is, I'm an international PhD student teaching college students at the University of Michigan. I would really like to address race issues in the classroom and improve Black students' college experience. I do not know what struggles they might have and what they might need from me. Would you share some positive experiences you had with professors that prolonged positive impacts on your career, if any? I will let either one of you take that first.
I can kick it off from a student perspective.
Mhm.
I think so. Thanks for asking the question. Thanks for being here. Shout out. Um, I think, of course, I can speak as a Black student, but I think you should speak to your Black students, because I guarantee that they have different brains than I do, and different ideas about the support they're looking for. They may not be looking for you to be like, all right, so let's talk about racism today. It's real. It's a big deal. To the Black students in this class, how do you feel about it? Because oftentimes that can, at least for me, feels very tokenizing, because then in that space, my Black experience is supposed to speak to every Black person in America and in the world's Black experience. Um, so, if you feel comfortable, if you've developed a relationship with them, I might recommend reaching out to them individually. Maybe not now because it's a break and like no one wants to think about school or professors. No shade to you, but all shade to all professors. So like and try to have those, see what support they may be looking for, because they may not want anything, they may not need anything, they may already have their support systems. Um, Something that has helped, at least where I don't feel singled out, but I feel welcome to a conversation, is when some stuff goes down, we can have that's how class opens up. We talk about it. That's been in my poli-sci classes. That's been in my African American studies classes. Just creating the space to debrief, because people, I feel like some people think that Black people are just able to compartmentalize everything. Like, there's racism, there's a pandemic that's tied to racism, there was an insurrection last Wednesday. Like, where did that come from? And then people are like, oh, but my Black students will still be able to perform to the best of their ability in school, at work. And I feel like oftentimes it's like, well, like, can we talk about these things where I'm at? Can you meet me where I am? So at least I can tell you, this is what I'm coming to class with. This is what I'm coming to work with. This is what I'm coming to our conversation with, and creating space for that. Because I think creating space for dialogue is really important. And at least for me, has been very helpful.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And I love that what you mentioned in terms of creating space for dialogue and not sort of shoving things under the rug without sort of creating that moment to be able to have these meaningful and vulnerable exchanges. With that being said, I'm also aware that not all educators feel equipped to be able to have the conversation in a wholesome and sort of informed way, right? And I know that because others have. I've heard this sort of thread before, and educators sharing that. But I think there's a wealth of resources at university spaces, and I think you can, instead of just relying on students to be the sort of, that's the first thing I would say, never single out a student to sort of be that moment to educate, right? I think definitely finding other resources and other, if there are centers on campus, or if there's other educators in your community, or if there are speakers that you want to sort of introduce to the space, to sort of facilitate that and open it up in the areas that you might not feel comfortable with. That can be a route. But I also think in general, it's asking the students who you're the instructor for, like, what does this look like for you? What would make it a wholesome learning experience for you? And what can I do better to expand on? And how do I have these meaningful conversations? I think teaching centers are great for doing that. And the Center for Teaching and Learning, CRLT at UMichigan, is one space that I thought provided helpful resources and consultancy around how do you even begin that conversation for people who might not be as experienced in that. So yeah, seek out those resources, and also ask your other resources, which are your students, about collectively what that might look like for the learning environment.
Okay. So we've got questions pouring in. Thank you both for those responses. But I see a few here about taking concrete action, which you talked about turning these moments into concrete action. So I'm just picking one right now that says, as a white student at U of M, what can I do now as concrete action besides educating myself? And I like that question because he put in there besides educating myself. And I think that's a moment that we've all been in this past summer and before of, well, just educate ourselves. We're going to read so much. Here are a bunch of resources. But I would love to hear your opinions on how do allies, white students, and others turn these into concrete actions. I'll start with Dr. Jolly this time.
Yeah, I was going to say, go ahead, Dr. Jolly.
So thank you for sharing that. And there are two things that I have in mind. The first is that I would say is the education process is ongoing, so that's going to be continuous in addition to whatever you pair with this with your concrete action. And so I think in terms of concrete action, that concrete action is also deep reflection, right? And I think it's also reflecting on, are you ready to give up your privilege? Are you ready to not give up, to compromise certain aspects of your privilege and the benefits of it? Are you ready to think about what white courage looks like for you? Right. And I think that's where it gets real, right? Because education is one thing, but to feel the embodied reality of marginalization or of compromising privilege is a whole nother shock fiasco that I have observed in my education and teaching of anti-racism work. And in addition to that ongoing reflection, which is a never-ending process, if you are committed to it and honest about it, I think another aspect of a concrete action, I think, is being informed about the organizing that's happening locally around you, and moving beyond the sort of symbolic, whether that be a hashtag or a bumper sticker or a Black Lives Matter sign in the yard. That's all cool, but I also think it's thinking about what does the substantive connection and community building and movement building look like in your own space? And what do you have to offer? It also involves talking to your relatives, your friends, your family members, the people who are in your immediate circle, whom you might find it might be a little bit more nerve-wracking and difficult to engage with around anti-racism, white supremacy, privilege, and elitism. But I do think it starts in your own backyards, whether that be with the people who you've known all your life, who are complicit in these systems and structures of violence, as well as the local organizing that is happening right in your own backyard.
Yeah, to echo Dr. Jolly's point, it's really about knowing what's popping in your area and finding ways to get involved. And I think for you, that's a very personal thing. Like one thing I can't stand to see is like when people take like selfies or when people take pictures at protests, or when they make it super obvious that they're trying to be an ally, because a lot of it feels performative and perfunctory. And so you really want that, like your relationship to whatever activism you're doing, to be personal. If you're a student at the University of Michigan, get tapped into the BSU, get tapped into any of the racial justice organizations that we kind of talked about today, because I think that they're all doing work. And if it's something as simple as, I don't know, can you shoot this person an email? What connections do you have so we can try to increase our network or try to get more people on board or see where everybody else's head is at? But I think this is something that people forget. Blackness is not just the relationship that Black people have to their oppressor. Blackness is it's a different level. It's just so much more to Blackness than resistance and fighting back. And so, mutual aid networks exist in the Ann Arbor area, in the Ypsi area. If you can volunteer, if you can donate, that doesn't have to just be money. It can also be your time. I think oftentimes we think about, what are Black people doing to fight against the system? But Black people have lives too. That's why I asked the question, like, what brings you joy? Because there are things that we are involved in that's not just it contributes to building an anti-racist world, but it's not solely challenging an oppressor. And so finding community organizations that are just trying to improve conditions. Maybe it's feeding people, maybe it's clothing people, maybe it's housing people. Finding ways to work on those is also contributing to an anti-racist world. And so I'd encourage you just to see what else is out there that's not just, going to a protest, signing a petition, because those things are important. And you can do other things. So yeah, great question though.
Good, wonderful, wonderful answers. Thank you so much. And we have so many questions in the chat, and I want to thank all of our guests for coming in and participating. I think at one moment while we were planning this, we were saying, what are we going to do if we don't get enough questions? That is not a problem here, because we definitely I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of these. So in closing this out, I do want to ask Dr. Jolly and Thomas just one more question, which is, this is the first time we've kind of done a conversation like this in this format. And I just want to make sure you both got out of it as much as I have gotten out of it. So do you have any closing thoughts and about what you got out of this conversation with your fellow panelists there? And I'm going to start with you, Thomas, this time.
Yee. This conversation reaffirmed that I stand on strong shoulders, because the history and the legacy of BSU didn't start with me. It's not all of me, and it definitely won't end with me, even though it's an organization that I wake up and continue to work from the wee hours of the morning to late at night. This really reaffirmed that I stand on strong shoulders, that people have come before me and have laid this foundation, that it's not just an undergrad thing, it's not just a graduate students thing, it's also an alum thing. And just understanding that so many people are trying to build an anti-racist world, trying to see a world in which Black people are truly liberated, in which we are truly free, I think has been something that I've really been able to take away from this. And understanding that my experiences are so similar and at the same time, very distinct from Dr. Jolly's experiences. But just being able to find commonality, understand that, hey, these struggles still exist, and that there are people on different sides of the issue working towards it. But also, dang, we really out here doing a lot, and we really out here making it work, and we're still taking time for ourselves and still finding joy and still able to engage in community building. I think this is also said to me that, there are 200 something people who are interested in hearing my self-talk, which is bananas, but makes sense for Dr. Jolly. So I understand why there are so many people here. And I think I think I've said a lot of things that may have ruffled some feathers. Sorry, not sorry. It shows that the Alumni Association, because oftentimes we do talk about, it's about where the dollars are going. And so this to me is saying the Alumni Association is giving Black people a platform to kind of say the pills that may be hard to swallow for some of our biggest donors. And I saw in the attendees that one of my scholarship donors is here. Thank you, John and Jan, forever thank you, because I think it's different when you see alum who have come through the university who may have seen these things, even if they didn't experience them, they may have seen them from distance. And they were like, oh, sucks, but not my problem. And to see that there are people who are like, dang, this might be my problem now. So yeah, this was great. If I'm allowed to share my contact information, I will do that in the chat. So yeah, thank you.
Dr. Jolly?
Yes, thank you so much for that, Thomas. A lot of what you shared resonated with me. And it was just lovely to speak to you and to connect and to sort of identify the commonalities across different generations of Black experiences. That's always lovely, as well as the broader experiences of University of Michigan students and alumni. I think one of the things that I'll take away from this engagement is definitely the importance of these organic conversations, building relationships, building networks and communities through these organic connections. You don't always need a CV or a professional question to connect to alum, that there are these different ways that we can offer sort of, we can give back, but also that we can sort of build bridges, and that's through exchanging these legacies, that's through building and complementing each other's work, and that's through really reimagining a better institution, but also a broader, better world with each other. And kind of, I had seen a question that was on my mind as we were wrapping up, from Debbie Willis, about, how the university can be supportive in keeping alumni engaged in DEIJ work, both on campus and in their own spaces, so that students of color can continue to benefit from alumni who have successfully made it. And I think one way to do that is through those organic connections, but also finding ways to, it doesn't always need to be a committee. It can be a committee, but also finding ways for us to sort of just be, know about the work that's happening, right, with the BSU, with the SCORE, with, as we venture out through our different aspects of life, but also, in addition to being informed, finding ways that we can build these bridges in our own local communities, right? To expand the work that's happening on campus, or that expand the work that we're doing around anti-racism and equity. It's also to find ways for alumni to sort of be foregrounded in a lot of the sort of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice initiatives, right? I think a lot of the times that the university reaches out to alumni for monetary donations, and I think there are other ways to donate that are very more meaningful with long-lasting effects, such as mentorship, such as these kinds of conversations, such as movement building and exchange and strategy sessions, et cetera. Not solely in moments of crises, but even beyond that. So that is the work towards institutional accountability and equity after the dust has settled. And so I think that's one way. And I just also want to big up some of the people who were a part of these leadership organizations. I know a lot of the times when you're full-timing studenting and working and doing political leadership, it's a lot. So I just want to big up several people who've done this work with me. That's Naomi May, that's Sadia, that's Princess Williams, that's Enrica Shabdaz Tucker, that's Tanya, that's Michael Medina, that's a few other people whose name I'm forgetting right now, but I just wanted to say, thank you for co-creating a better space, a better future with me. And it's been a pleasure to share space with all of you in attendance at tonight's event. So stay tuned for the future ones, and thank you.
No, thank you, Dr. Jolly. Thank you, Thomas. It has been refreshing just to hear two intellectual powerhouses just chatting it up. Again, thank you everyone for joining, and I am encouraging everyone to please keep the dialogues going. Thank you, and good night.